It is day 4,450 of Boswell Being in Business. Welcome to the readings from Oconomowaukee discussion series. I'm Daniel Goldin from Boswell, and to introduce today's event is Lisa Baudoin from Books and Company.
And I want to say welcome, everybody. We're thrilled to be hosting Maggie Shipstead. You know, Maggie, I just want to say sheep after a plot turn in the book, right? Maggie Shipstead is the author of Seating Arrangements, Astonish Me, and Great Circle. Her travel writings appear in Condé Nast Traveler, Travel and Leisure, Departure, and many other spots. If you haven't visited her website, I would recommend it. It's a great place to read some of these articles if you've missed them when they originally published, and to see some of the photos from her travels. So we are thrilled to be talking today about her new novel, Great Circle. Maggie, do you want to start by giving us a little elevator pitch and then maybe reading a bit to give us a flavor of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everyone showing up for afternoon book Zoom. It's nice of you guys. So Great Circle is about a fictional female pilot, which I specify because a lot of people have been Googling her name, which is Marion Graves, because they're like, is she real? Is she not? She's not real. Who disappears in 1950 while trying to fly around the world north-south over the poles. And she grows up in Missoula, Montana in the 20s, where she learns to fly. She flies in Alaska in the 1930s. She flies during World War II in the UK. And interwoven with her story is that of a modern movie star named Hadley Baxter, who's playing Marion in a biopic about her life, and kind of gets drawn into this question of who Marion really was and what her disappearance sort of means. So I'm going to read just 2 pages from the section when Marion is living and flying in Alaska in the 30s. Yeah, so this is 1935. 11 days into 1935, Amelia Earhart becomes the first person to fly solo from Honolulu to Oakland. Stars hang outside the cockpit window near enough to touch, she writes. 10,000 people surround her after she lands, and her red Lockheed Vega seems to wallow on a human sea. I wouldn't want to fly over that much ocean, says Marion's boss, the man with the scarred lip. He's not one for posturing, and she likes him for it. Most of the other guys say they'd do it too if they had the kind of money Earhart has from her husband and from smiling for pictures and putting her name on malted milk tablets and luggage sets and whatever else. They act like her flights somehow don't count, aren't real. Marion is a real Alaska flyer now. She shuttles between towns and what pass for cities, out to bush villages and encampments and lonely cabins, bringing mail, food, fuel, dogs, dog sleds, newspapers, motorcycles, explosives, wallpaper, tobaccos, doorknobs, you name it. She flies men out into the backcountry who strike it rich, and others who drown or freeze or get eaten by bears or blow themselves up. She flies corpses wrapped in canvas sacks. Once a corpse smells so bad she lashes it to the wing. Once a woman gives birth in her plane. Once she lands on the frozen surface of the Chukchi Sea to rescue the passengers of a ship locked in ice. Somewhere she picks up a Russian word, polinya, for the patches of open water in the sea ice where whales come to breathe. The landscape is secretive and harsh and impossibly immense, and she borrows some of its inscrutability for herself, its disinterest in human goings-on. Unfriendliness as another form of camouflage. In winter, the sun rises in the south. Far enough north, it never rises at all. She wears long johns and wool sweaters, and over those a reindeer hide suit. At first glance, you wouldn't even peg the pilot she's assumed a name, Jane Smith. Peg the pilot Jane Smith as a woman, would only see a shaggy black. She still remembers sitting in the Water Grizzly, signs a blank postcard to Caleb that way, and asks someone going to Oregon to mail it from there. But she carries a knife and a pistol for when second and third glances happen. Rough country. Cold is murder on planes. Fuel tanks freeze, hydraulic pumps don't work, rubber tires and gaskets turn brittle and leaky, instruments quit. On cold mornings, she lights a fire pot under the engine, puts a canvas tarp over it to keep the heat in, watches like a hawk because the gas or oil or tarp itself might ignite at any moment and sometimes does. She's put out more fires than she can remember. She's broken propellers, skis, a wing, flown with sprays of leaking gasoline fanning out behind her. Once, what she thought was solid ground had turned out to be marsh and splashed up at her as the wheels touched, flipping the plane. She was all right, hanging upside down in her seat, mucky water running in under her head. A mule team had come to pull the plane out. She patches skis with flattened out gas cans, propellers with stovepipes, struts with birch trees. She flies in weather others shake their heads at, stashes her money away as she's done since she was a child. Once she flies to McCarthy, only knows she's to pick up a man and bring him back to Anchorage. He's waiting beside the airstrip in handcuffs. He's a minor, she's told. He raped another minor's wife. Fine, she says. She has them stow him in back with some bundled furs she's picked up. They cuff him to his seat. 15 minutes in the air and she rolls the old junker plane tidily upside down. She figures if it breaks apart, at least she'll take him with her, but they come up right again. He's screaming, both his shoulders dislocated. Bad weather, she says when she delivers him under a bright blue sky, got bumped around a bit. The story gets out, makes a man think twice before he tries to get close to her. Come summertime, the one-eyed circumnavigator Wiley Post is touring Alaska with beloved national wit Will Rogers in a nose-heavy, cobbled-together plane. Wings from one model, fuselage from another, pontoons from yet another. Marion glimpses them in August when she's up in Fairbanks, shakes her head at that plane, those fat pontoons. Near Barrow, at the northern edge of the continent, Post and Rogers crash taking off from a lagoon and die. Marion knows lots of dead pilots now. Alaska's an easy place to crack up. Bush pilots fly into mountains, vanish over the ocean. All the more reason to keep to herself. No need to mourn. I'll stop there. Oh, you're muted.
This is such an epic novel, old-fashioned, and yet with a modern sensibility. It's, people have called it, I believe, I've called it the perfect summer read, and it really is. I love the idea that somebody could go on vacation and they know they only need one book. A, it's going to take them a while, and B, they will never get tired of it and want anything else. I love, and this is Lisa and I, we know the good answers. So we have to ask you, how'd you come up with this story?
And what was the kernel?
Well, there was one specific seed of this idea. So in fall of 2012, Seating Arrangements, my first book, had been published, and I was waiting for edits on Astonish Me, my second book. And I had about 100 pages of what I had thought would be my second book, and it got sort of bumped back by Astonish Me. And then I was like, okay, I'll go back to it. I was traveling in New Zealand and I was trying to work on it, and it just stopped working. I couldn't get anywhere. I lost interest in it. And so I was at the airport in Auckland and kind of feeling sorry for myself. And there's a statue there of Jean Batten, who in 1936 was the first person to fly solo from the UK to New Zealand. And I just thought, oh, I'll write about a female pilot. And I had no thoughts beyond that. I had no real reason for thinking why this would work, but it just sort of was something I accepted. And so I didn't start really working for another 2 years. And I still didn't have a plan. I never planned my books. But that was kind of the initial spark.
I assume at one point you thought maybe you'd have a book every 2 years forever, huh?
Yeah, I was very misled by my early experience. I wrote Seating Arrangements, the first draft in 8 months. And then it was, there were a couple years of revising it, I think, while I was also doing other stuff, and then I sold it. But then Astonish Me was like lightning speed. I had a short story that was a little long and I thought I'd trim it down, and instead I made it 90 pages and sent it to my agent. She was like, oh, this could be a book. And so I expanded it further, but that was from starting to work on the story to selling Astonish Me was 5 months. So they came out within 2 years of each other. And I was just like, I just whip these things off. It's no big deal. And so I sat down to start working on Great Circle in fall of 2014, sort of knowing it would be a little longer, but still thinking like maybe a year tops. And it took me 3 years and 3 months to write the first draft, which was 980 pages long.
But I imagine there was a lot of time spent researching in addition to just the actual writing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do the research as I go. I did a little bit before I started. Like the only sort of plot point I really knew was that I wanted her to fly in World War II, and I planned her around the world route. And so I started reading books about female pilots both in the US and the UK during that time, and I wasn't sure which one I was going to go for. But otherwise, I'd kind of start writing and then I'd be like, well, for some reason, I've decided to start this book with an ocean liner sinking. And like now I have to research ocean liners and how they sink. And so that just happened over and over and over again, every little thing. And so it was always like, climbing up the down escalator or whatever. And so that certainly slowed me down. And also slowed me down was I started doing travel writing. So I was also away from home a lot. And sometimes maybe I could work on the road, but usually not. Usually I'd have these breaks of even up to a month where I didn't work at all, which that was fine.
The travel writing obviously really helped this book a lot. It seems like it did. I mean, supposedly you went to almost every place in the book. Is that the case?
Yeah, there's really nowhere major in the book I haven't been. And even most of the places, almost all the places on her round the world route I've been to.
I mean, that's very unusual nowadays.
Yeah. And I think, I would never say, oh, authors have to go to every place they write about. Like, it's just not practical. And like, I will recognize the extreme privilege of the amount of travel I've done, particularly for free. And some of it's like, I don't have kids, it's my dog stayed with my parents and I would just go off. But it was hugely informative, particularly the polar regions. That was part of why I got into travel writing. The first pieces I did were sort of random assignments I got. And then when I asked if I could start pitching, they were like, sure. And so the first story I pitched that went through was to the New Zealand sub-Antarctic for Condé Nast Traveler. And kind of I pitched more and more Arctic stuff. And so gradually that became kind of my thing. And so editors would be like, we need someone to go to a desolate wasteland. And like, let's see if Maggie's available. She loves those things. And, like accumulated some, specialized knowledge. And also I encountered more and more people who have like genuine expertise in these remote locations. And so they kind of like my own experience started to inform Marion's character, but also just meeting people who are sort of true adventurers, I think, really helped me kind of access that in the book.
Now, I guess her circle determined where she was going, but did that also determine where you wanted to go? What came first?
Yeah, well, I chose her route first. Like I probably did that, or I remember planning that route with my brother's assistance. My brother was a pilot in the Air Force. Maybe around Christmas in 2014. And it was challenging because there aren't very many lines of longitude where there are enough places to land. There's just a lot of ocean. And so there are kind of two possibilities. And one of my brother's points was that in 1950, the USSR would have been a difficult place to land and deal with. And so I opted for the one that I chose, which is sort of New Zealand up through the South Pacific, Alaska, Svalbard. And I'd been to Svalbard before I started writing. So that was part of it too. I went on an artist's trip where it was like 27 artists on a 3-masted tall ship in the Norwegian high Arctic. It's crazy. Down the West Coast, through Europe, down the West Coast of Africa, and then across Antarctica. And Antarctica was always like the big problem with the sort of feasibility of this. And it was really important to me that it be possible, even though at that point in time it would have been really unlikely to be able to do this. And so in the plane that Marion's flying, even if you fill the fuselage with additional fuel tanks, to cross from South Africa across Antarctica to New Zealand would require you to refuel twice. And at that point, there were no permanent bases on Antarctica. So I coordinated when she goes with an actual historic expedition that was in East Antarctica at that time. And I was like, well, they could have brought her fuel. And so kind of built that into the book. And then on the Ross Sea side, going toward New Zealand, there were these abandoned bases called Little America, kind of 1 through 5 or 1 through 6. which would have had cash fuel. So I was all a matter of sort of like working it into the reality of the world, while also, then gradually incorporating my own experiences too. Oh, but that wasn't quite your question. Anyway, I did pitch like places that I knew were on her route. And then some I picked up kind of by happenstance, like the Cook Islands. I was flying home from New Zealand and you can take a free layover there. So I do that, and I got some stories to Alaska and things like that.
Now, the first question, the first interview thing is like you answer the question you want to hear. So you're a real professional. I am fascinated by the idea that your publisher said in today's day and age, when I hear so many authors being told to cut, that, and I know you have the same editor for 3 books, but how did you convince them that this book needed to be 600 pages? It did, but how did you, did somebody try to grab pieces off of it, or?
Well, yeah. So, when I sold it, it was still 980 pages, but we gave my editor a 500-page partial. And the last half was less polished, and she was kind of like, how much more is there? And my agent and I were like, it's none of your business. Don't worry about it. And so she understood it was very long. And from the beginning, she was like, we need to make this shorter. And I was protective of it being huge. Like I was never going to agree to it being reduced kind of beyond I wanted all the pieces that are in there to stay in there. Which, many of which are arguably extraneous. And there have been some reviews that are like, well, does this need to be this long? And it's like, no, of course it doesn't. Like nothing about a novel is like inherently necessary. It's just what it is. And it's a book about vastness and about the impossibility of sort of lassoing the scale of the world into any sort of digestible piece of culture, really into an understanding. So my editor and I, over more than 2 years, did 3 or 4 drafts, and each time it lost pages. But the last draft, she was kind of like, like it still needs to lose pages. So it went from 980 pages to 750 manuscript pages, which then when it's typeset is this slender 600-page book. And there was sort of some like hemming and hawing about if we could take out these sections called the incomplete histories that sort of rush through time. And I was reading from one of them kind of, or even getting rid of Hadley, the movie star. But I really didn't want it to be just a straightforward historical novel. I wanted it to be more complex and more challenging. But most of the cuts were small, pervasive cuts. Like there wasn't a big chunk that got cut. There were a couple, chunky things that got cut. Like I did have an incomplete history of Antarctica, which was asking a lot of a reader 500 pages in to be like, let's go back to Pangea, and so it was really a long process of like tiny nibbles away at it. But
it's not unusual too nowadays for these to have, you would to have something like an incomplete history of Antarctica in a book. It might not be as big as this, but I won't call out any books. But it's funny because Lisa and I were talking about this. It's like I wonder if somebody tried to get rid of Hadley, because we were discussing about how whether this is a dual narrative or Hadley is a framing device. And I think I perceived it one way and then I changed my mind. And it's so tricky because you write Marion's from close third, but Hadley, see, this was your trick. You went to Jordan and said, I'm writing Hadley in the first person, so you're going to fall in love with her and you're not going to be able to get rid of her.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Like when I, think of like, try to reconstruct the decisions that I made in the process of making this book. It's just impossible. Like there's no rhyme or reason for anything. It's always just like, I just felt like it. And it was really early in the process, like within a month of starting to write, I wrote the Hadley section where she leaves this nightclub with the pop star sort of cheating on her famous celebrity boyfriend, and it had nothing on the surface to connect it to what else I was working on, but I was like, no, this is the missing piece. And I've used the word acidic. I think like I just wanted this tone that's different than the marrying tone, just something to break up, to cut through sort of the bulk of the book. And then I also wanted just sort of the lens on how much of a life is lost, like any life in general, and sort of the unknowability of people. And Hadley's looking back 65 years after Marion disappears and trying to sort of piece together who she was. And also as part of this game of telephone where Marion left behind a notebook, and then a novel is sort of made out of that, and a movie's being made out of this novel. And each time it's like another distortion. And so because the reader has a close look at Marion, it's obvious how off things have gotten. And I think Hadley is someone who has an intuitive understanding of that, because she's somebody who's always been speculated about online and in newspapers. And so she kind of knows that this is wrong. And then the question is for her is sort of like, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
And in the beginning with Hadley, I was just sort of ready to roll my eyes and like, oh, what are we going to do with this? But she became one of my favorite characters. She has such wisdom and insight that you don't expect her to have. And it just comes out straightforward.
Lisa, it's so interesting the way, like, I love that, the way that, that Marion is sort of unknowable. And so with Hadley, you put us on the inside and nobody understands her, but we understand her.
Yeah, that's true.
I really like that parallel. And Dave, our friend Dave said that he loves Hadley too. So we're glad that we get the axe. Go on.
She's a little bit divisive, and there are other reviews that have sort of suggested like maybe we didn't like. I think some of it's generational too, but like one of my touchstones for this book was Possession by A.S. Byatt, and I love that book. And there are parts of it I will reread forever, and there are parts of it I will never read again because they're so irritating. And for some reason, that book gave me the confidence to be like, not everyone's going to like every part of this equally, and like some people will like all parts of it, but not everyone. And that helped me take a risk, I think, with this.
Yeah, we're both Hadley fans. And we also reminded me a little, your book has a resonance for me. And I'm only saying it like people who like Jess Walter should read this book, I'm just saying. Because first of all, the Great Circle, some of the scenes and the settings reminded me of Cold Millions, but the kind of romantic, historical kind of contrasted with the contemporary Hollywood satire sort of reminded me of it as well. And I also like the way the contemporary story sort of links to your other books a little more in terms of tone. So like, I'm still me. So.
Yeah, and I'd written a short story. I have a short story collection coming out next summer. And the title story was actually a story that was in Tin House that I wrote before I started working on this book. And it was in sort of a first person intense voice of a movie star. And it was kind of a riff on the Tom Cruise, Katie Holmes relationship. And so I'd sort of experimented with that kind of voice before, and I wanted to use it more, partly because I enjoy it. And I live in LA. And so it's also just like writing about, something that connects a little bit more closely with my life. And I've always my stories are all about really different things and really different tones and voices. And my novels have been quite different. And so this was the first book that I sort of took that sort of disparity and kind of put it in one work.
And I want to say, I mean, just even Hadley, you can see the arc of women being able to have their own voice, but also not have their own voice still. So it was nice historically to see that arc. But I want to say, pick up on the LA thing. Your paragraphs about LA were brilliant. That description of LA when they're together, was it Redmond? No, yes.
Redwood, yeah.
Redwood.
The shrooms part?
Yes, the shrooms part. It was fantastic. I think I would read that again and again. It's like this long narrative poem, a love poem to LA. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was something I actually do remember when I thought of doing that. And I was like weirdly leaving the gym in my neighborhood and just sort of thought of it. And I really picked away at I didn't have a place for it in the book, when I started writing it. And so something I really picked at for probably a year before I could sort of set it in the book in a way that made sense. But yeah, it was sort of a real pleasure to be able to write something that voicey, which I don't usually do.
I really enjoyed it. But I
What?
have a bookseller that was questioning it, and I was like, "That's my favorite."
Oh,
Yeah,
people questioning. I run a book club, and and it's a famous book, and I love the book club people very dearly. But we were reading a 225-page book, and a third of them said it was too long. So,
yeah. What are you gonna do?
I don't know. And I'm not saying if I agree or not, but it's just like, just the way people are. One of the things that makes the book so long is you have several other characters who really could have had a novel on their own, and more power to them. So I'm referring to Marion's brother Jamie, and also to Caleb. Were you ever asked to cut them back, and how did you pitch the idea of them being an important part and bringing in backstory and things, especially Jamie?
Yeah, well, I mean, the nice thing about writing the whole manuscript without a contract or anything is that I could really do what I want. And then by the time I sold it, I was like already there. And I know Jordan, my editor, said that when she got to the first chapter where it's Jamie's point of view, she was like, oh, like we're going to deep dive into Jamie now. But then it ended up being, according to her, one of her favorite chapters where he goes to Seattle as a teenager. I like working with minor characters because it's just less of an investment. They can be vessels for what interests me, but it's not this like commitment to having to maintain their sort of coherence in the same way I had to with Marion. But yeah, I mean, Jamie did get his trajectory got a bit changed during edits. I used to have this plot line where Marion took him to Canada and he joined this religious community called the Doukhobors, which is a real thing. And they're like Russian Quakers, basically. And they live communally and they're pacifist and vegetarian. And their prayers are all sung. They're Christian, but they don't use the Bible. Totally fascinating. But Jordan was like, this is just one weird thing too many. Like, this book has enough going on. You don't need Jamie to like join a commune. And so I had to take that out and then sort of connect the two ends, and sort of the end of his arc had been the same, but I had to sort of connect these two ends, and it was definitely a good change. Yeah, I mean, in general, I think all the minor characters probably did get cut back a bit just because of how, as I said, pervasive my cuts were. But no, I think that's one thing I've been really lucky with working with Jordan Pavlin is I say, some people's taste is define their taste by sort of excluding things. And Jordan certainly has specific taste, but it's also defined by this radical openness. Like she'll just sort of take in anything. And so she was very on board from the beginning and sort of got what I was trying to do, and had sort of a similar vision for the finished book as I did.
And I saw the minor characters in a way of defining Marion, because we don't know Marion very well. She really keeps herself locked down, and we learn more through Caleb, through Jamie, through Ruth about her contours.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that is like something that's really useful for me as the author to have them for.
So they're not minor.
Yeah, there you go.
they're essential, and the essential secondaries.
We had a question. I'm sure lots of people are fascinated by your depiction of Jamie's artwork, and I love it because it plays to the theme of scale as well, and so it becomes sort of an echo of Marion. But also, I kept trying to figure out what it might look like, and I'm gonna ask it anyway. Is there anybody who hates like that? we can show people like.
Yeah, I guess like the short answer is no. But I did look at paintings by Lauren Harris, Lawren Harris, Canadian landscape artist, and other Canadian painters, the group of 7, kind of from that era. But yeah, this idea that he sort of is trying, and I think it's explicit in the book, he says he's trying to get at the idea that the world is too vast to put in a painting. So I describe his work as having this origami quality, or of being sort of folded or bent. And I think inevitably just writing about other art forms, you end up writing about writing. And I really felt that in Astonish Me when I was writing about, ballet dancers' sort of quest for perfection that can be almost debilitating and chasing something that's impossible. And I think that's a part of writing. And I think I have a pretty healthy relationship with the impossibility of perfection. Like I do get to a point where I'm like, this is fine. I am done. Like I recognize it's not perfect. I will do no more, and then writing about Jamie too, I think I was writing about the sort of project of this book in a way as well. And I mean, I think both those things have in common, like this inherent impossibility. And that's a lot of what this book is about too, like Marian's flight around the world. There's this question of, if she hadn't disappeared, if she'd succeeded, like what would that have meant to her? Like what would the point have been in a way? Because you're back, you've exerted a tremendous amount of effort to deliver yourself back to where you started, and the horizon's still there, and there's still so much you haven't seen.
Oh, she would have gone on another trip.
Yeah, probably until she vanished, maybe. I mean,
I mean, like
a fair number of people operated at that time, still do. Yeah.
And I think that using Jamie in the war to sort of record things with his vision and his beauty against the horror of what was happening too, and that whole phenomenon of recording art, the war through art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that was something that came up just in my research. I hadn't known about combat artists, and somehow came across a PBS documentary called They Drew Fire, and it was about, and I think this predated World War II, but it was about World War II artists who were recruited by every branch of the military, and their brief was just to capture the quote spirit or essence of war. And some of them could sort of choose where they went, and others were sort of sent places. But there was an artist named William Draper who was working in the Aleutian Islands, and so his paintings were sort of the inspiration for the paintings Jamie makes in the war.
Wasn't Dr. Seuss one of those? Didn't he do that? Wasn't he?
Did he?
I thought so.
I would believe it.
Daniel,
I don't know.
Do you remember? I'm going to look it up. You can ask the next question.
Yeah.
Well, like everybody just looks like Sneetches. It's like D-Day, but
I thought he did war cartoons, but I didn't know. But I don't really know anything. I'm just going to shut. I'd love to talk a little about Montana. Originally, I mean, weirdly enough, Lisa and I are doing summer reading with Larry Watson in 2 weeks, and we're like, one of our themes was going to be Montana novels, and we're like, oh,
we just
can't stop. Yes, exactly. I heard that you originally had set the book in Nebraska.
I was, yeah, in kind of that 2-year window after I saw the statue, but before I started writing. For some reason, I was like, Nebraska, and I went to graduate school in Iowa, and my parents live in California, and so I had a dog. And so during the 2 years I was at Iowa, I drove between Iowa and California, I think 10 times. And so I've driven across Nebraska many times. And I don't know, there's a long tradition of American pilots coming from the Plains states like Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska. And so that was what I was thinking about. And then right before I started working on this in spring of 2014, I didn't really live anywhere. Like my stuff was in storage in the Bay where I'd done a fellowship, and I had my dog, and I was sometimes at my parents' house and sometimes other places. And I was like trying to figure out where to live, which is a really paralyzing choice if you kind of have not, like, you can live and work anywhere. And so one of the places I sort of tried on for size was Missoula. And through a friend, I rented part of a house that was like right on a mountainside. It was amazing. I had this view over the city, and I could just open the door and be on a hiking trail. And I was there for 2 months, and only after I left did it sort of occur to me that I could set the book somewhere I knew better than Nebraska, and had the advantage of sort of interesting topography and sort of a frontiery quality in that era. So yeah, that really opened the project up for me, because I think I did actually try to write opening chapters in Nebraska, and they just had nothing in common with what I ended up writing.
Lisa has a
Yeah,
Lisa
it
has
wouldn't
a
have worked.
thesis on why Nebraska wouldn't work and why you had to do
It wouldn't work. Yeah, I mean, because Montana just has that ruggedness that the story needed.
Yeah, and I think that decision, of course, really changed the story and made it rugged. Yeah, I agree. I don't think I would have written it. I just would have gotten stuck. And then whether or not I figured out what the problem was, kind of, who knows?
You would have had to go back to that New Zealand book, which we still don't know anything about.
Oh, yeah, it was kind of like a take on Mary McCarthy's The Group, which like a bunch of other people have done, and it was just like
Everybody should do that book eventually,
I
but
know.
you can keep it in your back pocket. Everybody has to do a book that's either inspired by Jane Austen or Shakespeare. Everybody has to have a book that writes backwards, you know, and everybody has to do their version of The Group. So it's the Daniel code of writing.
It's mandatory. So. Yeah. I will not be writing that book, but I did think about it for a long time. I
think it's hard to disappear in Nebraska. It's a little easier to disappear in Montana. And that was so part of the book.
Yeah, I mean, you can see every part of Nebraska from anywhere in Nebraska. Yeah. It's just literally no hiding.
Could you talk a little about you speak a lot about the tale of the sitting in the water grizzly and the two-spirit and how that, without giving anything away, how that sort of connects into the book.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's funny. On a couple of book events in the chat, people have been like, I'm halfway through and I'm wondering why, like sitting in the water grizzly, why? and I'm always like, well, just wait. Like he comes back. There's a reason. But yeah, this was a real person that I came across in my research of historic Montana, and was what we would now call transgender. Native people might call two-spirit. And sort of he appears in the writings of these European explorers like David Thompson and John Franklin, who later famously disappeared in the Arctic. And I think there was a Jesuit priest also wrote about him. And initially he showed up as a young woman at David Thompson's camp and married one of his men and sort of created chaos and was kicked out. And then a couple years later shows up again in David Thompson's journals as a man with a wife and this sort of business selling prophecies and working as a translator, and could translate among all these languages, which I think is really interesting as far as being someone who's transitioned their gender, being sort of inherently kind of liminal or something. And then, I just thought like, oh, this has to go in the book, which is how all my decisions were made. And then I'd have to like retroactively create a reason for it. But Sitting in the Water Grizzly in the book becomes sort of this touchstone of the fluidity of gender in a way, but mostly about identity. And Marian has periods in her life when it's just simply more convenient for her to sort of present as a man. And she doesn't have any sort of vocabulary for gender identity, and she just sort of does it out of practicality, and also because she feels, I think, like that sort of life that was then interpreted as being inherently masculine is what she must have. And so, yeah, I think that informs her choices as well. But then, yeah, there is a payoff for Sitting in the Water Grizzly.
And that tradition goes through many different cultural groups of Native Americans across the U.S.
And in very different ways. Yeah, it was so interesting to learn about that. There would be people who, were gay, but were cisgender, and there were people who just like did the tasks of the other gender, and some were, spiritual leaders or medicine men or that sort of thing. And just really interesting how different this manifested in different tribes and was accepted to different degrees, and has always, of course, been a part of life.
Right. Yeah. It's a lot to learn there. It's my turn to ask questions, isn't it?
We have a bunch of questions too and some of them are very, very long, so they might take up 30 or 40 minutes.
Well, and I was just thinking about the writing structure, and I know we've touched on this too, but I liked it. It felt very much like the journey that we were on with Marian, just the way you changed the way you wrote certain passages, the brief histories, but then sometimes it just felt like I was reading a log entry, a listing of things. The chapter headings were different. Instead of saying, you know, it was 2 hours before something, it was 5 years and 7 hours after, you know, it was a very different way of viewing time, whereas Hadley's in the present was chapter 1, chapter 2 is very linear, and the other just moved very like a logbook. How did that just come naturally? Did you intend to mix up the styles to transition?
Yeah, a lot of it was pretty intuitive. Like from the beginning, I was working with different voices, although I'd occasionally have these freakouts where I'd be like, is it right to put it in the present tense? I don't know. And I'd just like be paralyzed for a day, and then I'd sort of either make a change or just live with it. I've talked a lot about I use Scrivener, the writing application, which was totally necessary to this book. I could not have written this just on Microsoft Word, and Scrivener made it so I could move the pieces around, which it did get reshuffled in the writing. And there were a couple of big changes that I made, like Marian's flight, which in the published book is all in pretty much one section. I think it gets interrupted once kind of toward the end of the book. I had initially conceived of that as being interstitial throughout the book. And so, and the book has, you know, in I think a fairly light way, a circular structure, which I, you know, thought of also from the beginning, but having the flight split up like that was kind of one too many things to keep track of for a reader, I think. And I had also experimented with writing those sections as her actual logbook, like in first person, like what she'd written, but it was really difficult not to make it repetitive. So I sort of scrapped that and redid it. And then the sort of timing, how each chapter will sort of establish a relative timestamp to the events that have just happened, was actually a suggestion from my mother, who read my very first draft. And she was like, maybe you could say like how much later this is, instead of, I always had the dates, but then you would have had to flip back and be like, when did that happen? And I thought that was a great idea. And for something so complex, it was like a good handhold. But
I really liked that. It really helped. And it did change the way I was viewing the way the time was happening.
Oh, that one time when you go back 3 months and you're like, and I just saw that the 3 months earlier, I'm like, oh crap. Like you just, I knew, I didn't have to read it. I'm like, bah. So that was pretty darn clever of you. We have a question from Laura. First of all, she makes a little comment about how the dedication is to your brother, but it could have been Marian dedicating to her brother. She loves the relationship between the two of them, as so many people have. But what she wanted to know, your inspiration for their sort of difference of Caleb feeling life so deeply and suffering, and Marian being so stoic and intrepid, despite, you know, making them seem almost like looking like twins.
Yeah. I can't remember why I decided to give her a twin. I'm sure it was a random impulse, but then the way they started to develop, I was kind of, they're fraternal twins, but are not really similar people. And I always thought of it in terms of balance, like Jamie's sort of defined by his gentleness and Marian's sort of defined by her boldness, but I think they enable each other to be that way. Like they are sort of fused in this way that each one can sort of diverge from the other with this sort of, I don't know, common bond there, sort of still grounding them. So yeah, just the way they sort of, you know, evolved on the page was like that. And then as they become adults, I think they sort of start to come back together a little bit. Like they each of their sort of main traits gets compromised and softened, as sometimes happens. But
we have two sales reps, so one of them isn't even yours, and with questions. One of them from Jason wanted to know how, like, I think we talked a little about this, but the way, did the secondary characters that you had, like Ruth and Eddie and Caleb and Wallace, like, did you know they were going to be major characters, or did they grow into it?
They grew for sure. I mean, partly because I didn't know how long the book would be. So it was just like, oh, Caleb, I'll give, Jamie and Marion a little friend who lives down the river, and then I didn't appreciate that 600 pages later, I'd still be like accounting for Caleb's movements at all. And yeah, Ruth and Eddie, I think Ruth, was more intentional, I suppose, as far as my original intention for her, and then the role she actually fulfills in the book. Eddie was a pretty late addition. I think connecting him being, I don't know if this is a spoiler or not.
It connects two parts of the book.
Right. Just that, I mean, from the beginning that her navigator's name is Eddie. And so, yeah, I didn't initially know that he would be the navigator. And so one thing I've realized with my books and my inability to plan, like I would love to outline a book and know what I'm doing, but because I do think that there's a lot of mysterious brain activity happening. And so lots of times I'll come to a problem late in the book and the solution is already embedded in the beginning. It's like, oh, I need a navigator for this round the world fight. And that's like, good thing I wrote a navigator character, but it's not always conscious, like how, what function the characters will fill.
It's surprising how often authors will talk about that they thought they were writing two different people and it was the same person.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot. And also, Lisa and I have been doing a running total of planners versus pantsers in literary fiction, and the pantsers win.
Yeah.
So those people who tell you they plan, they may feel superior, but they are a minority.
They're pantsing, they're planning their pantsing. They get it going and then they have to like keep track of it, which looks like they planned it.
I remember doing an event with Lisa C once, and I think she's a big planner, and she also does all her research in advance and has this elaborate color-coded sort of system of exactly what she'll need for every part of the book. And I was like my mind was blown. I can't imagine.
You should hear the Amortals theory of planning a book. It's amazing. I mean, my brain, brain exploding is really the only way. Our Dave actually noted that you acknowledged Kirsten Valdez-Quaid and Jennifer Dubois for being forever friends, and he happens to love both those people. And Lisa and I actually both read Five Wounds and Love, like it's love. So he wants to know about writer friendships.
Yeah, Kirsten and Jennifer and I we had the Stegner Fellowship at Stanford together. So it's a cohort of 5 people each year. And so we were 3 of the 5. And the odds of us being extremely close friends just by chance are pretty small, but they've really been, really important writer friends for a long time. And I love both their work, which is also great. You don't always love your friends' work. And I loved The 5 Wounds. It was such a reminder of how funny a writer Kirsten is. And I'm not sure that comes through in the description of the book. So totally, for anyone there looking for a book that has both some pathos and will make you actually laugh, that's totally a book. I have lots of other writer friends too. It's can be addicting to hang out with people who are sort of hyperverbal and hyper observant and always have a take on things and like want to drill down on why people do things. My best friends in LA are both novelists and TV writers. So
who are they?
Emma Rathbone and Asia Gable, who are both novelists and also write for TV. Asia's book The Ensemble is pretty recent. Those are my novelist friends in LA. And then, I have this endless text thread. I think it's in my acknowledgements as well, with Manuel Gonzalez, Ted Thompson, and Margaret Lazarus Dean. And we all became friends at Breadloaf, the writers' conference, like 5 years ago. And we've texted every day on this text thread ever since. We call it a 4-way platonic marriage. So,
Well, writers, I assume it's very affirming for you to have writer friends. I'm sure you want some people who don't write, but maybe just like one.
Yeah, precious few. I mean, my sort of best friend went to law school and then started a brewery in Nashville, so she has a bit of a different thing. But yeah, I don't. Most of the people I hang out with are writers in some capacity, and you know, they understand the business. It can be tricky, of course. Like during the period when I was writing this, the sort of 6.5 years since my last book came out, it was hard to watch like friends publish books and, you know, have their careers progress. And meanwhile, I was just like toiling in secret on this thing that no one had read any word of. So I think that's something, you know, just the fact that careers go up and down and have different moments of frustration and different moments of sort of like everything going well is something that I think writers who are also great people find their way through. And some writers are not great people and they don't.
We find that amongst booksellers as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think it applies to like the general population.
Yeah. I want to know if you had any surprises during the research, anything that was just like a moment of like, this is just an unheard of gem.
Yeah, I mean, sitting in the water grizzly was one, absolutely. Some of the stuff about Missoula's kind of red light district that had in the 1910s that then got sort of cleaned out. And so by the time I was writing, it had sort of gone underground. That was interesting. That sort of frontiersy, Wild West stuff. I had this whole crazy riff at one point that was like the first thing to get cut. That was about like, it was sort of in this the incomplete history of the 30s, and yeah, where this female scientist who was a Jewish refugee from Germany was sort of discovering nuclear fission at the exact same moment. This fisherman in South Africa dredged up this fish, a coelacanth, that people thought had been extinct for like millions of years. And these two things were sort of happening simultaneously. This has nothing to do with the book, which is
I was going to say, how did you draw these together?
Yeah, it just like, went into this whole thing. But I was like completely riveted and transfixed by that. So yeah, lots of little things, and then more just like, you know, broad knowledge about Antarctica, where I went twice. I went to the Ross Sea on the New Zealand side, and then to the peninsula from South America. Yeah, just interesting things about the explorers, like the Little America where Marion lands before she disappears. I really am kind of captivated by how there are these pretty permanent structures built on the Ross Ice Shelf, which for those who aren't familiar is like the size of France. It's like all the ice from Antarctica is pushing down toward the ocean. So there's this huge floating platform. And so it's the closest place you can be to the South Pole. So like Roald Amundsen had his base there. But what happens is that the ice keeps pushing out and it breaks off and forms icebergs, and these sort of drift away, which is what happened to Little America at some point in the 60s. But like naval vessels saw some iceberg floating away from Antarctica with like a smushed layer of Little America sort of visible in it, and like all these sort of objects they brought, like canned food, just like drifting out in the ocean where it would all, you know, melt and sink. So lots of melting and sinking in this book.
We have Laura has said that her takeaway theme was about Hadley wanting a conclusion, wanting the end to be the end, and the idea that we don't always notice beginnings, but endings are easier to detect, and that creates the circle. How are you, like, we sort of see the theme play out in Marion's life. How are you wanting the theme to play out in Hadley's?
I mean, in some ways, Hadley was really difficult for me to wrangle. Like, some people have asked what I think happens to Hadley after the book, and I'm like, I have no idea. Like, she's on her own, you know?
We wanted to know, one of the things Lisa said to me in the middle of the book is, do you think the movie worked or not? And
yeah. Yeah, I don't really know. I don't think I would bet on it being a good movie. I think it was probably not a great movie. And I think Hadley, like, that's, you know, Hadley's attraction to Marion, or part of it is she's Hadley's very self-absorbed and thinks the universe is sending her messages. And she's like, what does this woman's life mean for me? Like, what can I glean about my life from this other woman's life? And yeah, I think just contending with the unknown also is kind of in the book's DNA, because, you know, when I was working on it and would say, oh, I'm writing a book about a female pilot who disappears flying around the world, people are like, oh, like Amelia Earhart. And like, that's a completely reasonable response. And it also drove me crazy. Partly because I'm just really interested in how impossible it has seemed for people to accept that Amelia Earhart crashed in the ocean and drowned. Like, there was no way anything else happened. Like, that absolutely is what happened. And so, but there's this sort of cottage industry of like, people who go down there find random stuff, and it's like, this is a clue, like maybe we're getting closer to finding out what really happened. And it's like, no, we know what happened. These are pieces of like stories that don't exist. And so that was really part of it too, sort of the lack of or the way I was thinking about beginnings and endings is like this difference between disappearance and death, and like why no one can accept that this happened.
But so true for so many deaths.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
Somewhere Elvis is, you know, flipping burgers or something. I hope he's dead now, but for a long time. Yeah, I was, you know, I had been thinking about pilots had been your inspiration and stories, and you know, I guess we've always, you know, when I first started bookselling, everybody was reading West with the Night, and it was 25 years ago that Knopf published I Was Amelia Earhart.
Oh yeah.
They were very hot. There's this, it's like the anti-book of yours, because it's like really short. Because the rumor was that the head of Barnes & Noble woke up in the middle of the night and turned to his wife and said, we need shorter books. And a whole bunch of people. And then there was actually another run like 2 years ago, if Lisa remember, like a whole bunch of like, this is a short story. No, it's
like Jenny O'Feel's books. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I'm always of the opinion that's like, the more books, the merrier. Like, I like long books. I also like short books. They just like are different, you know, they fulfill different roles. But, you know, it was funny. I did get, what you're kind of asking about this earlier, but I did get some pushback just from like randos when I was writing it too. Like somebody who asked about the book, and when I described it, he was like, well, that's a non-starter, like that's too long. And people will be like, do they even let women write books that long? And it's like, yeah, I was like, who's they? Like this industry that's dominated by women? Like probably, I don't know.
Well, Judy, one of our friends, Judy, wrote and said, long novels are fine when the reader stays engaged. Two of her favorite long books are A Fine Balance and The Weight of Water. And I would have to say, I got my copy of The Silver Boy right here.
Wow.
I would like to say I read it twice, but I didn't.
Yeah, I like a long book. I really liked like some of the books that I sort of drew on or read and thought about when I was writing this book, were The Signature of All Things, Elizabeth Gilbert. I really love that book. Life After Life, I loved All the Light We Cannot See, Pachinko, Tale for the Time Being. I don't know, they're satisfying.
And I should note to our listeners that both Anthony Doerr and Ruth Ozeki have books coming this fall.
Oh, I didn't know about Ruth Ozeki. That's exciting. I knew
I listened to one of these pre-interview things with Hannah Tinty, and it sounds so good. And our buyer already read the Anthony Doerr. Love. So,
yeah, so far
exciting.
I've heard only good things. Very exciting.
Would you like to recommend any books to us?
Sure. Well, we talked about The Five Wounds, which I think was good. Some of my like favorite pandemic reading, these two books really have a lot in common. Monogamy by Sue Miller, and then Writers and Lovers, the Lily King book.
Oh, we love that.
Loved it. Yeah, they're both like Cambridge, Massachusetts books, and like, I don't know, I really admire in some ways books that like stay rooted pretty closely to their subject. Like I'd really like to write a quiet like family drama about, you know, a marriage or something, and Sue Miller is such a master. And then I also really liked this book called The Bellwether Rhapsody, is that right? By Kate Reculia. And it's sort of, her books have sort of a quality. One of her books is clearly inspired by the Westing game, like an adult version of the Westing game, but her books have this sort of tone like that I found really delightful.
Westing game, Milwaukee writer. So
Oh yeah.
but not much else to say about it. So I'm looking up whether our buyer, our book editor, Jim Higgins, just really loves that book and loves to write about it. I'm looking up Bellwether Rhapsody now.
There's a question about the hotel, or maybe I'm missing it.
Well, the book Bellwether Rhapsody is about a hotel.
About the hotel. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute, I don't remember a hotel.
Oh, and then I see the other question, the adult book Take on the Western Game. It's called Tuesday Mooney Talks to Ghosts, I think.
Yes.
But Raculia, Raccula, yeah, which is great.
I want to see the picture behind you of the ocean. Is it a photograph or a painting?
It is. It's a large photograph.
It's beautiful. Now, see, I figured that's what Jamie was painting with a little more slats,
Yeah, it's by a photographer named Corey Arnold, who was a king crab fisherman and photographer. So he shoots a lot for National Geographic. And then, yeah, there's large prints. And actually, there's a photo over my desk, which let's see if you can see it. You can see a corner of it that's just of sky. So it kind of has ocean and sky in a large photo form.
I like it. Daniel's typing away.
I know, I'm trying to get all these books in the grid. Not that anybody, you people watching it, you should look at some of them. Look at all this work we're putting in. So we're trying to find the collected works of Kate Raculia.
You can click through those and then they take them back to the website too. Is there something that you're looking forward to book-wise coming out that we talked about the Anthony Doerr.
But
I've had a couple booksellers love it.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. I need to buy Crying in H Mart, which I really want to read. Yeah.
That's what I've heard too. I haven't read it yet. Actually, my rep who's on here told me I had to read it.
Yeah. And I just wrote a book review, which I can't say what book it was. And there's another thing I had to read. And so this is the first moment in like months when I don't have to read anything. And it's incredible.
The world is your oyster.
That's right.
I know that I because we'll have these run of event books and I'm like, okay, my next 7 books are planned out and but I have this rule that I like to read one old book a month, and it has to be 3 years old. And people are like, that's not that old. But for a bookseller, it's ancient.
Yeah. I can't even imagine the torrent of books you have to sort of grapple with. Like agents and editors read so much, but I think like booksellers maybe take the cake.
I think that the other difference is I think agents and I think they consider the reading work time, whereas we can't really read on work time. So you have to just really love it so much that you're always doing it.
I tried to read on Sunday because I was getting a little behind. It didn't work. The guilt was just too much.
You can't just sit there and like shush the customers and page through your book.
There weren't even customers in the store.
That's my way of getting people to work off sites, is that it's the only time they're allowed to read. But otherwise, yes, people have this romantic vision of a bookseller sitting at the desk. And I think in some obscure secondhand stores, you are allowed to do it. But otherwise, it's pretty rare. I'm sure there's people who do it, and everybody should run their bookstore however they want. But I just find that probably paying attention to the customers is probably a good thing.
Probably.
It's just me.
Sounds radical, but I suppose.
I think we are wrapping it up. I sent some more recommendations. It's all California writers, Cynthia Dupree Sweeney and Ruthie Thorpe.
I love Ruthie Thorpe. Her book, The Knockout Queen, the most recent one, was great.
We have I'm sorry. That was my bookseller, Chris, who I work with, has a staff rec of The Knockout Queen next to Punch Me Up to the Gods, another book he really liked. And I was like, I wonder if I can come up with more boxing books to do a display. I'm already working on a dance novel display because there's now I'm going to put Astonish Me in it because both Megan Abbott and Rachel Kopelke-Dale have ballet novels coming up this year.
Yes, I know. Perhaps that connects back to what I said about book
Oh!
reviews.
Oops, did not say anymore, but
And your book will be on our Montana displays for our conversation with Larry
yeah, we're
Watson.
bringing it
Okay.
up in 2 weeks. Thank you so much. This was really great. We
Thanks,
appreciate it.
guys. It was a delight.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was fun.
And thank you, Lisa, and
Thank you, Daniel.
to everyone who attended. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Keeping
support.
bookstores alive, guys. Good job.